INET is privileged to have with us today Orville Schell, who's the director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. Orville has written about 10 books on China, and he's been deeply involved in China since the mid-70s. Fluently speaks Chinese, he's been in and out for decades. And he's currently grappling with his latest book for the last 2 years, a book that's really been challenging his own assumptions about what's really going on in China and how it actually stacks up to what's going on in the West and the rest of the world. Now, INET is deeply concerned on China and China's economy and theories pertaining to China. And so that's something we're going to delve in today with Orville. Great to have you here.
My pleasure.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about just the premise of this book you're wrestling with, and one of the really fascinating themes here that you personally are wrestling with?
Well, as the whole world knows, China is presently in the middle of this rather extraordinary period of very dynamic economic growth. I mean, 10% growth for basically 2 decades, a little less. And the question that occurred to us, and we've been working on a project at the Asia Society called the China Boom Project, documenting this period of dynamic growth from the perspective of 125 or so diplomats, economists, CEOs, writers, journalists. How do they explain it? How did it happen? And what do they make of it in terms of what it was that finally came together to sort of ignite China into this period of very high speed and very impressive growth? Now you have to remember that historically speaking, I mean, China was the sick man of Asia. Couldn't do anything. And if you look at Chinese history over the last, say, 125 years, I mean, what it looks like is a series of failures. One reform movement after another, one revolution after another, one great leader hits the wall. And it is very enigmatic of how this period from the end of the Qing dynasty, when the first self-strengtheners, they called themselves, were trying to borrow from the West to fortify the Confucian escutcheon and the imperial system, down to today. So as part of this project, the China Boom Project, I and a colleague set out, are in the process of writing a book to try and look at this last 125 years and say, how do you make sense out of it? What was actually at work during all of these decades, from the Guangxu Emperor to Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and now Hu Jintao? What was it that was actually sort of trying to get out, express itself? And our sort of preliminary conclusions are very interesting, and I should say very counterintuitive to us. So I think this is a curious sort of expedition, sort of an archaeological expedition into China's past that I haven't seen anybody else really ask. I mean, this didn't just spring forth like Athena out of the head of Zeus when Deng Xiaoping came to power and said, let there be light. Things don't work that way. I mean, history always adds up, even though when you're in the middle of it, you don't see where it's headed. Ex post facto, you can look back and make sense out of it. But strangely, nobody has done that. One of the things that I think we began to realize when I went back through this history, which I knew well, but I'd never bothered to make sense out of it, was that in actuality, what most Chinese intellectuals and actual people who ended up in leadership positions were after, it really was not democracy. It was not greater openness. It was not the things we associate with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and all John Locke and Voltaire, et cetera. What they were really after, and still are, is what's known in Chinese as fuqiang, wealth and power. And you see this theme again and again and again and again when you go back and read the people in the late Qing dynasty, they would borrow democracy if it would, or republicanism, and overthrow the emperor even, if it would help make China strong. But this idea that the West had, and has, although we're somewhat less, I think, enamored of it now or convinced of it, that everything is sort of teleologically heading towards more openness and more democracy. That's the ineluctable force of history, sort of the Hegelian idea. This is Francis Fukuyama. This is, remember the end of history? Democracy won. We were there. Well, it turns out history started up again. And we're hardly there. In fact, we may be there, or the world may be there, meaning China. So suddenly, in the last 5 years, we realized there is another model. It's not very democratic. It's authoritarian, Leninist capitalism. And then there's our model. Our model is in crisis, economic collapse, paralysis in Washington, European economies foundering left and right in debt, and China booming. How do you explain it? What does it all mean? How does that kind of realign our whole notion of where the world is headed? What's the best way to govern? What's the best way to deliver for people? All of these things are now up for question, just as is the whole financial architecture of the global economic system. China came rampaging into the middle of this thing, and nobody's quite figured out what the best angle of repose for them is.
So this must have been really difficult for you actually personally, because you have been a real part of all the books you've written and all your time watching China. You personally have actually helped people understand that kind of trajectory towards democracy and openness and a lot of these values. I mean, it's been a kind of an interesting. So part of the book is actually you coming to terms with your own kind of intellectual struggle around this, I would say.
Well, I think actually, the best books are one where the writer actually gets surprised by where they find themselves going, not a sort of a destination that you predetermine. And indeed, I think in the sense that I am surprised by what I find myself learning and thinking, I think I'm very emblematic of a kind of a confusion and a very profound reluctance on the part of many Americans and Westerners to come to grips with this question. That in fact, what used to be the developed world, the first world, the world that seemed enthroned as the right way, because it was successful, it became rich, it became powerful, that we now may be in a moment of history where everything is at a tipping point and shifting. So structures which we became very accustomed to, power alignments, ways of doing things, ways of negotiating, ways of working out problems, have sort of, their shelf life is over. And everything is in need of rebalancing. This is certainly true in economics. I mean, not only is the US and China economically desperately in need of some rebalancing, but the whole global architecture for the way the world interacts economically needs to be reformulated and rebalanced. So this is a kind of a very disturbing, I think, kind of a moment, because it requires that everybody see things differently. And who's on top, who's on bottom, who's first, who's second, who's third, who's used to being number one, who's used to being ascendant, and who's used to being inferior, superior. All of these things now are going to require a very tectonic and I think difficult period of realignment and adjustment.
Talk about some of the elements of a Chinese economy that potentially we should be open-minded about would be superior to the Western market-driven democracy, liberal democracy kind of controlled way of doing things.
Well, I think the first thing that should be said is that even though China has been very successful and very dynamic, it is also fraught with substantial weaknesses. And so we don't want to get too carried away to think that they have all the answers. And I think the West, particularly Americans, can very easily get into a self-flagellating mood, although I think we deserve a certain flagellation at this point. But it isn't to say that suddenly they have everything right and we don't. We've been here before with the Japanese, and the Japanese turned out they didn't have it so right. So we have to have a perspective. But I think that there's so many things now that I think we want to kind of reappraise, and it requires a lot of new thinking. I'll give you an example. It used to be, I mean, literally 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago and before that, that we in the West, particularly in America, who prided ourselves on our open markets and our free enterprise system as the most dynamic way to kind of fuel the engines of growth and forward motion, looked at China and its 5-year plans as very Stalinist, backward, retrograde, part of a command economy which was almost quaint in its sort of antiquarian nature. And we prided ourselves on our innovation, our ability to jump to occasion and to not be hemmed in by such structures. Well, now we come down to the new kind of global world where things like world trade, climate change, nuclear proliferation, all of these kind of very large problems which can only be solved in a more multilateral context. And particularly, I would say, the question of energy. And we suddenly, I think, can look at a 5-year plan as a godsend. Here's China. They're about to have another 5-year plan. They're setting direction, goals, targets. They're saying for the next 5 years, listen up, folks. Here's how we're going to do it. Here's where we're going to go. Everybody has to play ball and help out so we can get to the end of that 5-year plan successfully. We in the West at this point have not only no 5-year plan, we have no plan whatsoever. And every 4 years we throw the president out, and every 2 years, you know, all of the House and much of the Senate gets churned over. And we have no capacity, so it seems, to do any planning at all. And there's no conceivable way that we're going to solve the problem of energy and climate, just for an example, unless we can do some serious planning. You don't know how to, businesses don't know how to invest, they don't know how to plan, they don't know how to look ahead. And businesses now in America are begging the Congress, in effect, tell us what you're going to do. Whatever you're going to do, we may like it or not like it, but we'll adjust to it. We can do that. But if you don't tell us, you deny us, in a certain sense, of the competitive advantage of ourselves being able to plan in a rational and reasonable way. China is doing that. And so this is a tremendous competitive advantage for them. So we end up with a situation where the competition, I think, is very extreme. We didn't expect we would ever arrive at this point. We're ill-equipped to completely comprehend the way in which a system which we once disesteemed as backward and undynamic is very counterintuitively turned around and helped made China a competitor of really, unforeseen proportions.
Tell me, though, now, as someone who is kind of bi-global, or however you phrase it, I mean, you've equally got a foot in China and you've equally got a foot in United States, and in fact, you're heading this project on U.S.-China relations. when you think long term, which is kind of the way we like to think here at INET, I mean, do you imagine a kind of a hybrid system evolving that's actually somehow borrowing the best of both or marrying somehow the best of both? Or do you see it as a kind of little more zero-sum situation that, you know, either it's going to be one or the other is going to model the way towards the future, and we should at least contemplate wrapping our heads around the possibility it could be now?
I mean, I think that it's unlikely that the so-called West is going to want to, you know, initiate a kind of authoritarian capitalism in the countries in which we live. I think, however, the developing world is another question. I think there are many countries, I think particularly Russia, eyes China with a certain envy. They have a predilection towards that sort of authoritarian control anyway. If it works, if it delivers, well, then it might be quite compelling to them, and some other countries as well. But I suspect what's happening is that, you know, we're entering a world where there will be a variety of these quite divergent economic systems. And we're going to have to learn, even though we may disagree with each other, on how to interact to make sure that the sort of the global structure on which we all depend, world trade, finance, et cetera, is functional. So I like to sort of compare the U.S. and China to, you know, a couple, which is in couples therapy and needs it, and very often feels like it should get divorced because we're so different and we disagree on so much. But the reality is, divorce is not an option. Mm. It's not an option in any of the areas in which we have to kind of deal with each other, whether it's nuclear proliferation, trade, currency, you know, climate change. We're in this together. There's a Chinese expression of, you know, sleeping in the same bed but dreaming different dreams. We're going to have to learn how to have those different dreams and systems, and even to criticize each other, but also to functionally work together.
INET is really interested in, you know, how do we rethink a kind of global financial infrastructure. And in fact, the next big annual meeting is going to be in Bretton Woods in the spring. Just give us some of your reflections on, given, you know, the financial rise, aside from the manufacturing prowess and all that, but this, the idea of how China now, its currency, its cash reserves, its all the things we know about it. How do you see them in kind of playing a role in kind of re-architecting how we think of global finance going forward here?
It's going to be very, very difficult. Partially because while China wants to be, you know, run with the big guys and is running with the big guys now, I mean, we are hardly up to speed, at least our citizenry are hardly up to speed on what is happening, which means that the government has a very difficult time in acting in a way that recognizes this new sort of level playing field. And, you know, in many ways, we feel that the whole Chinese system is antithetical to a lot of American values. You know, we have this problem with the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, China just completely rejects the notion of that this Peace Prize should be given to someone that they've locked up because he's an ardent democratic activist, whereas we think this is fine. And so we have to figure out how we're going to navigate those profound valuative differences. And of course, China gets very offended, as they have with the Nobel Peace Prize, when we trumpet these values and try to publicly, they view it as a kind of a humiliation, hearkening back to the old days of, you know, occupation and whatnot. So this is going to be very difficult. So they have to be in it. And they too have to sort of recognize that, you know, maybe another generation, the next generation will feel more comfortable being part of it, that their responsibilities, which are going to have to take into account things other than just what the Chinese Communist Party wants for China. That's where, I mean, this idea of the stakeholder is a difficult one for, I think, China to fully accept at this point, because to date, they've acted in their own sovereign interest. Most countries do. But some countries do, and they mess this up sometimes as well, feel an interest beyond that. I mean, I think certainly that's what drove us into Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, we may have done it indelicately and unwisely and really messed it up. But there was an expression that we have some larger concern other than our own narrow interest. On the other hand, you have to say that you wouldn't want China writing itself too largely around the world in a military sense. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they are somewhat reserved and are not overly willing to play this new global role, which they're actually going to have to play, is not a completely bad thing at this point in history.
You mentioned the younger generation. And again, another kind of INET thing is that really it's about the next generation of economists, in this case, is really going to reinvent the next systems. People who are, you know, invested in their old paradigm of thinking and their old theories that they've been championing for decades are not going to be the ones that really rethink the next systems. Do you see a kind of a generational split? Do you see something about, let's say, Chinese in their early 30s, 20s, and even maybe less, as really, are you hopeful that in fact there's a real different mindset that's kind of evolving there, and the one that would be more more knitted into the global economy and actually be more productive in terms of figuring out this next great economic paradigm on the planet?
I do think there's great differences between each generation, and one has to be very impressed with those generations that are moving up, 30, 40, 50-year-olds, many of whom have been trained abroad, some who haven't. And they do see things very differently, and they're much less ideological. However, I would say that they, and this would be a generalization, but I think a true one, are also more nationalistic. And they bristle at any criticism, anything that harkens back to what they view as the old paradigm of Western judgment, you know, demanding that dissidents be let out of jail before a presidential visit, that kind of thing. They just don't accept it. And now they don't have to. And so it raises a real question for the United States. What do we do? Do we just say, oh, well, okay, lock people up, we won't say anything, it's too important that we get along with you on other matters? Or do we stick to our guns, and do we have cards to play in that realm? So the new generation, incredibly impressive, and I think in many ways negotiable as cosmopolitan actors on the world stage, and good business people, scholars, you know, et cetera. But this nationalism is something which we're going to have to learn how to deal with, and which they're going to have to learn how to sort of, I think, modulate to be effective in the new kind of scheme of global leadership. But then the United States has had similar problems with sort of America first, you know, these colors don't run, you know, attitude, which is all too prevalent in this country as well.
There's been a lot of talk of using new technologies and new collaborative environments and video channels and to kind of build an INET community of young economists all over the world. I mean, do you see that as practically possible given kind of the next younger generation there? Everything from language to kind of technological channels that are not open. I mean, does that seem like something that they'd be open to and interested in?
I think it would be very interesting. I think you certainly could do it. The internet is controlled in very profound ways in China, but I think in this realm, the economic realm is as free as any realm because they too want to make money. So I mean, there's a kind of a gradation that ends up with sort of, you know, radical political reform, which is unacceptable, but you know, business, economics, and you move down the spectrum, it gets more sensitive, but that's the least sensitive. I think it would be a very interesting exercise, maybe a little bit like our China Boom project, where we've interviewed 100 and whatever it is, people, for you to go and do, say, 20, 25 economists or people who have, or officials, ex-officials, present officials, to see what are they thinking about and what would they find, what role could they imagine for China playing comfortably, and what would be the sequence of China's involvement, and how would we go about reassembling a post-Bretton Woods architecture. I think that would be an incredibly interesting exercise, and it would also, I think, give people who are outside of China a very easy way to see what it was they were going to be dealing with.
Fascinating. And you know, on a very practical level, I mean, how widespread would English be in those circles? Is that something that
You know, it doesn't
really,
matter.
Doesn't matter, okay.
It's reasonably widespread, but I would say let them talk in Chinese, because that's what they do best.
Exactly.
And they can really express themselves. And when I do interviews, I don't like to talk in Chinese, because I can't speak as subtly or as kind of, I'd like to be as articulate as I can be. So I would say do it in Chinese and do a voiceover or do subtitles and then do a transcript in English. Fair enough?
Let's flip it to a Western student or a student in other parts of the world outside of China, as a longtime China hand and one who's familiar with that economic trajectory. Where are the, you know, some fertile areas that if you were even we are, you know, knitting together undergrads who are going to be going on to grad work. We've got grad people looking into postdocs. We've got, you know, the whole kind of track of economists. Where would you start? Any tips on where areas you'd say, my gosh, if some, you know, there's a virgin turf here or there, or where would you start doing potential research or things that might be particularly useful? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it would be interesting to have some grad students look into, you know, two areas to see what has been written in Chinese on, as you suggested earlier, new economic thinking, of how they're viewing their own model. You know, to what degree is it a model in their eyes? Or do they sort of push that away? Oh no, we don't have a model, we're just experimenting. And also to get an assessment of how they imagine China's role in this new world. You know, they now have somebody, this fellow I think maybe on some board or other, Zhumin, you know, who's the, at the IMF, is China's sort of representative, unofficial representative, but he turns out he's like number 3 in the hierarchy. And eventually the IMF has to be reformatted to have more Chinese representation officially, not just unofficially. And to date, what the US has sort of said has gone because they have the preponderant share. But this needs to be reformulated. So it'd be very good to talk to someone like him, find out who else in China is thinking about how do you restructure something like the IMF, and then maybe go to the World Bank to see what's the state of play in terms of Chinese thinking on some actual institutions that will have to be either replaced or restructured in some way to get the kind of realignment that we're going to need to bring countries like India and China and some other country, Brazil, into to play roles commensurate with their actual roles in the world economy.
had made an earlier caution, which I think was well said in terms of we shouldn't get too carried away here on the ascendant model or where the world's going. And I think you made a very cautionary tale of we've been there with Japan. I personally was a foreign correspondent in Asia in that ascendant period.
Right.
And,
you remember.
Everybody was talking like we'd all be working for the Japanese, and obviously we know how that played out. So, and also China is facing enormous challenges that just kind of some ways dwarf what we have in the West in terms of poor peasantry and environmental kind of catastrophes of just enormous magnitude. I'm just curious, giving you a little space here to rebalance a little bit of what could also be ahead that might constrain essentially the effectiveness of China and make it so it might balance out in a way that right now it seems not as clear. Any thoughts on that?
We all know really only one thing about economies with any sort of inevitability, and that is they go like this. They're cycles. And there's never been an economy that's just done this forever. And China has been doing this for 20 years, almost unprecedented in history. Not only been going onward and upward, but at a 10% growth rate. This is not even approachable by anyone else. We'll see about India. So at some point, China's going to hit a bump in the road. It's so closely involved or with the global economy that it's also vulnerable to things outside. It's no longer an autarky, that it just gets to do its own thing and can separate itself from the world. So that's a real danger. And when that happens, because so much of its legitimacy is based on its economic delivery, it could have a real crisis. It doesn't have sort of foundation documents, constitution, it doesn't have a common value system to turn to. It doesn't have sort of civil society that's as evolved as in many Western countries. There are many things it lacks that are safety nets underneath its ability to provide just delivery on the economic side. And then there are many other fault lines and many other weaknesses. The question of environmental damage is profound. Whether they can get on top of that, probably in many ways, I think they can, but it's a huge challenge. The challenge of moving another few 100 million people into cities. You have cities like Chongqing, which are, 32 million people. I mean, it just dwarfs anything that's ever happened anyplace else. To provide 15 million new jobs every year, to keep all of these people on the escalator going up, exceedingly difficult. And then you have a lot of unrest. You have massive corruption, because you have to remember here you have a system where the party controls property, and the party controls the banks. So in order to deal property, there has to be some official who's being paid, maybe $1,000 a month tops. Of course he's going to want to rake off and pay off. And then he's friends with the banks, so you have property and banks coming together, and this is how you get bubbles. So corruption is a problem. Public unrest is a problem. The confiscation of property, because there's no private property. Huge problem. You get a whole village, the guy comes in, and the officials say, sorry guys, we're taking your village. You move someplace, we'll get you nice high rise out in the boondocks. Well, this makes people really angry. So there are all kinds of things like that that are seething beneath the surface and which scare the wits out of the leadership, and we don't hear much about them. And Chinese media doesn't cover them because they don't want the dots connected. But you know that they're scared, because otherwise they wouldn't be so assiduous in their control. To control the media, control the internet, control this. When the Nobel Prize was awarded, they're stopping scores of people from leaving the country at the airport. Why? They just worried they might show up in Oslo. That's a lot of control. So these are problems. One of the main problems is not China. It's us. I mean, we have a Congress that's like one big dumb animal with no central nervous system. It can't seem to do anything. And yet somehow we're supposed to dock with China. We're supposed to form policies that can imagine a new future with China. And we can't even support our own schools. So it's very alarming. And China is just churning away over there. And for us to figure out a new angle of repose with them in a bilateral sense on a whole host of issues, we have to have an ability to form policy and, even more important, to implement it. And we seem paralyzed at this moment from being able to do it. So we have a very strange situation of some of the smartest people we've ever had in history in Washington. And they're really hobbled. Very hard for them to act. And another thing, they're broke. So they don't have a lot of money to move around to do much. So they can sign a lot of memoranda of understanding with China, but unless you can put more than $15 million on the table, I mean, you're not in the game.
So your final question, given all we've laid out here, are you fundamentally more optimistic or more pessimistic about what's going to evolve here in the next 5-10 years in these, in particular this Chinese-Western relationship?
More optimistic or less optimistic? I have to say I'm pretty pessimistic about America. But on the other hand, I do know America has amazing powers of regeneration when it wants to. But I see us sort of steeped in a kind of a lassitude and self-vindictiveness, and I think it's not our finest hour. I see China running, going like a racehorse off into a somewhat uncertain future. And I see the world now sort of really lacking any country to lead it in a way which it had become accustomed to having America lead it, sometimes for ill, sometimes for good. But it's a very strange situation where we find the United States sometimes sort of begging China to lead. Who would ever have thought we'd arrived at this place where we used to be kind of trying to push them away and we didn't want them to lead. And yet we're deeply distrustful of them. We're deeply distrustful of their values, and we're also deeply distrustful that they will evolve to have the kind of appreciation of the common weal which we like to imagine we have, even when we haven't had it. But so I don't know. I mean, this is an amazing moment in history where everything is starting to shift, and all of the old structures and architectures have sort of run out of shelf life. And yet we seem to have, when we look at climate change, a complete catastrophe in terms of a multilateral ability to establish a new multilateral framework. So we're back into feudalism, with everybody doing whatever they do, a lot of good things, but no overarching policy. Can we come together on a new architecture for global finance? I don't think it's going to be any easier than on climate change. And whatever happens, it will require that each country, not just the US and China, have a more reasonable assessment of their stature and power and position in whatever this new world is going to be, and the structure that's going to represent those new alignments of power, balances of power.
Well, that's, I think, a nice place to stop, but it's been a fantastic interview, and as always, really interested in your insights into China, the United States, and the world. So thanks for being with us.
Well, it's been my pleasure.